So when I first read the synopsis of the new German Netflix movie The Privileg, it sounded like it could be a lot like The Skulls from back in 2000, with secret societies and weird moments. Is this though really what this movie is about? Years after his sister's tragic death, Finn is increasingly haunted by nightmares and demonic visions. What his family dismisses as psychotic breakdowns due to childhood trauma feels ever more real to him. As horrific events around him begin to escalate, he can no longer pretend that it's all just in his head. So this is a mix of environmental sci-fi and supernatural with some mystery and then some slight horror thrown in. The lead character of Finn is painted from very early on to be an unreliable narrator, making it hard to determine if everything that we experience is really happening. The movie opens with a very odd scene and also introduces us to some menacing looking imagery. Within the first minute or maybe even less, we're shown this shadowy or smoky entity that torments some of the characters. And while there's no explanation for this at the beginning, that makes sense because it is the opening sequence, there is a lack of explanation that continues throughout the film, which then becomes a little bit problematic. As Finn goes about his days, he has many different weird and traumatic experiences, and I personally really like how the story sets him up to feel isolated, even within his own home. His parents are concerned and doting, but it still feels like there's some gaslighting from them going on. Now, there's some pretty obvious foreshadowing that happens pretty early in the story, but its full meaning isn't revealed until much later. And I like the intrigue that this creates, but I do wish that it could have been more concealed from the narrative because the instant that info is given, we can get a pretty good idea of where the story is going to be going. The crux of the movie rests on Finn and his two friends trying to figure out why Finn sees some weird stuff and then what it could all mean. That shadowy thing that appeared at the opening of the movie continues to make slight appearances throughout, and each time it increases the intrigue to a little degree. And then that mystery is amped way up when Finn discovers something odd in part of his daily routine. Now, I think this is where the story begins to pick up the pace and then gain a little bit of urgency. Max Schimmelfennig, who plays Finn, is really good at being confused, disturbed, and fiercely protective. Now, his friend Lena is played by Leah Von Aken, and she brings a kick-butt attitude to the story. Now, while Finn is constantly gaslit, Lena is decisive and action-oriented, and they make a good team, and I like their chemistry. Now, unfortunately, though, the story feels like it's trying to cram this supernatural aspect into the sci-fi story. The environmental sci-fi portion is grounded in reality, and it can actually be fairly disturbing in what it means for all of the characters within the narrative. And there's this deviousness that's also touted, and I thought it was pretty engaging, but it really needed to go deeper within the story. There are only glimpses of the rationale and ramifications for this portion, especially where a couple of characters are concerned. Plus, when there are some reveals associated with this element, there's no weight given to the moments. They're briefly touched on, and then the story moves on. That was disappointing, but I guess because the story hadn't established a great deal of intrigue around this area, the entire progression just kind of becomes sort of blah. But I think the weakest portion of the story is the supernatural angle. This feels shoehorned in and very out of place. The story tries to tie in the supernatural with the environmental aspect, but it just doesn't make any sense. Now, like I mentioned, the supernatural part is present throughout the entire story, so I appreciate that there is consistency, but the reasoning for its inclusion just isn't established. There's even a question about genealogy and relationships that feel like it has some massive importance, but as quickly as it's brought up, it's abandoned. And then towards the end, when the climax comes, there's a sequence where the supernatural element is reliant on the sci-fi, but it all feels anticlimactic and then false. It's just boom. Okay, now the characters are going to do this action and they will be affected in this certain way. Why? Well, come on, don't ask that question because the story doesn't really know why. And I know that's vague, but I'm trying to avoid any type of spoilers in case you do want to check this out. Now, it's clear that the story attempts to have some very devious elements created for certain characters, but none of them are given context. Now, at first, I thought this was just to build out the intrigue, which it did, but because it's shown and then abandoned, these happenings are just random ideas thrown into the story. Now, there is genuine suspicion that is built around a couple of background characters, which should have created some real discomfort, mystery, and even creepiness, but the story didn't ever spend any time developing this out. This movie has elements to it that certainly have potential, especially when it comes to setting up Finn to be an unreliable narrator, and then throwing all kinds of weirdness at him that others just don't seem to be aware of. And the supernatural element with the inclusion of the smoky entity is curious, and even the environmental aspect could be terrifying, but all of it's shallowly built with ramshackle support. The environmental angle is shown and then explained, but it's never followed through to its full outcome. And the smoky entity and the supernatural elements struggle for justification because there's no reason for it to be included. Now, because of the inclusion of that smoky entity thing, there are obviously special effects that are in use. And I liked the design and the imagery that is created when it came to this portion. But not all of the special effects hold up. There's an instance where something falls from a great distance and it looks very fake. And then the ensuing carnage, it's even worse looking. Now, luckily, these instances of bad effects are minor when compared to the decent ones. So overall, while this could be similar to The Skulls, this is an entirely different type of film. The Privilege is a mysterious, supernatural, environmental sci-fi that has strengths in two main characters. They have good chemistry and are convincing in their distress and discomfort when it comes to mental anguish. But aside from some of the characters, the movie is ineffectual in knowing the type of story that it wants to tell. Each of the ideas are half-thoughts that contain some meat to the content, but not enough to fully flesh out a full concept, resulting in a frustrating and disagreeable way to spend an hour and 47 minutes. Most of the special effects look good, but are not enough to create an atmosphere that is foreboding, creepy, thrilling, or even engaging. Now, unfortunately, this culminates in wasted potential because the story certainly contains elements where this could be powerful and even disturbing. There's sex, nudity, profanity, and some violence. I give The Privilege 1.5 out of 5 couches. I am really in need of something fun or great to watch. What can you recommend for me to check out? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.